Hi, it's Mark back with another tutorial, and today we're looking at both Lightroom and Photoshop at the subject of sharpening. So exactly what is sharpening? Well, sharpening can be the result of having a higher resolution picture, so the more pixels you've got confined into a small space, then the better edges and things of your subject will be. But it's also subjective. It's often available in filters and sliders in Photoshop and Lightroom to apply edge contrast, because that is what sharpening actually is. It's applying a contrast at the edges, natural borders within your picture. So let me quickly demonstrate that, and then we'll jump into actually doing some work. So on this picture here, which is Denzel again, the deer which comes into our garden very regularly, if we go to detail, we're in Lightroom at the moment, and we've got a sharpening slider here. You may or may not be able to perceive much on screen. I'm hoping you can, because I'm doing extremes, but let me make it more visible. I'm going to leave it at 100. I'm going to click on the mask button. I'm going to hold down my Option key or Alt key, and everything that is white is going to be sharpened. Seems an awful lot, but as I slide this over, you can see Adobe Lightroom is trying to find edges. And if we slowly go through, you can see more and more of the picture disappears, and we're left just with the most significant, the most obvious, the most highly contrast edges. So that sharpening, even though it was 100%, is only being applied to that element of the picture, and therefore it brings out the definition at those edges, applies contrast in edges. That's sharpening. Let's have a quick look at Photoshop, because in Photoshop, and I'll move me out of the way. Okay, so up here in Photoshop, if we go to filter, and then we go to sharpen, you've got sharpen, sharpen edges, sharpen mask, unsharp mask. Does it unsharp something? Well, we'll find out all about that and more after the titles. Okay, here we are in Lightroom. We'll be doing Photoshop in a minute, and we're looking at sharpening. So sharpening you will find under the detail panel here, and within the detail panel you've also got noise reduction, and there's a good reason for that, because generally when you add sharpening you introduce noise. I'll come back to that in a second. But first we're going to zoom in quite a bit. So this is at 200%, so people wouldn't generally look at the pictures in this level of detail. No pun intended. So sharpening, well, you've got a slider with little and a lot, and you can immediately see how it's picked things up and introduced a lot of noise. And generally less is more, but with sharpening I do tend to go heavy-handed on this amount slider, because as I showed you in the introduction, I always then mask. So holding down my Option key or Alt key if I was on a PC, click on the mask and slide it over. White is which is going to be sharpened, and so I bring it over. I just see that I'm sharpening those edges there. So Adobe's trying to find the edges. Now if I zoom out for a second, just got to fit, and click on that again, you can see what else it's trying to do. So there's elements of the grass and the leaves in the foreground, some of the bark in the background. It'd be nice if we could just, if that's what you wanted to, leave the sharpening, let's say I wanted that amount, leave the sharpening just around the deer. And you can do that. I'll come back to that in a second. Masking in general is how much of that sharpening across the whole picture you want in. Find the edges. So having found the edges, I can now tell you about radius and detail. So the radius goes from 0.5 over to 3. Very small number. The radius is in pixels. So I'm going to leave it at 1 for the moment. Here's our edge. So around that edge where we're going to apply the sharpening, which essentially is just increasing a bit of contrast at the edge point, we're going to only have a radius of 1 pixel. So that's the radius. What is detail? Well, we've identified where we want to sharpen. We've identified how wide we want to sharpen. And the detail is how much within those targets. So if I go back here again, if the detail is at the zero end, then it is the thicker, bolder, brighter elements that we can see here that are going to be more targeted. So that's clearly the outline of the deer, particularly the legs. Whereas the detail is over to the right, up here towards the hundreds side. It includes all the other finer parts. But again, it's all subjective in this one. This is not a consequence of having a really good number of megapixels in your camera to give you finite detail down to the smallest amount. This is about being subjective. Notwithstanding that, this is all global. Let's zoom back in and bung some of this detail up, deliberately bring some horrible noise in, just to show a quick word about noise reduction. In its simplest form, I will leave noise reduction for another video, but in its simplest form, if we bring over the noise reduction, you can see how it starts to blur and get rid of some of that noise, but it starts to take away the sharpening. So that's your trade-off, getting the two. Okay, I'm just going to reset and zoom back out. I mentioned that perhaps you're not worried about sharpening things, but you just wanted to try and target an area of sharpening. Well, you can do that with your adjustment tools. So your adjustment brush has got a sharpening slider. So once you've slid the slider with your brush, bring back some of the density, some of the flow, make it a little bit bigger, you could then come in and apply some sharpening just to where elements where you actually want that sharpening to happen. So if I take the sharpening away, you can see the eyes become dull. If I bring the sharpening in, you can see the eyes start to prick up a little bit. Also, for some reason, saturation was down. Let's reset that. Now bring the sharpening in and then out. There we go. Other things which are sharpening-esque, of course, are texture, bringing texture in, bringing clarity in, and sometimes a little bit of dehaze can be used, and together they could build up a better tool set for the overall sharpening before and after of what you want to do. So don't always contain yourself to something called sharpening on a panel on its own, because it is for the whole picture, even though you can adjust the concentration, and it is kind of singular in what it does. Consider also some of the adjustment brushes, because then you can partner the sharpening up with other things such as texture, and it might give you a better result. So that's all I've got to say really about sharpening in Lightroom, and now we'll jump over into Photoshop. So here we are, same picture, different software. We're in Adobe Photoshop now, looking at Denzel, or Denzel looking at us, and we're going to look at the various ways you can sharpen in Photoshop. And there's a sharpen tool, then there's various filters. There's a sharpen filter, there's a sharpen edges filter, there's a sharpen more filter. I'm surprised there isn't a sharpen even more filter. But then there's also Smart Sharpen and the mysteriously named Unsharp Mask. But before we get cracking on that, can I ask you to do me a favour? If you like these videos, please consider giving it a thumbs up. And if you like these videos, please consider clicking on the subscribe button, because that helps me grow the channel, which is nice. Right, let's get cracking, shall we? So first things first, over in your tool set here. And the first one we're going to look at is over here in these tools for blur, sharpening and smudging. And the sharpening is the triangle tool. And within it, you've got strength, which is percentage, so it's 0 through to 100. So what we're going to do is just do a little targeted sharpening on the eyes and the antlers of the deer. So Control or Command J to make a copy, and Command or Control plus to zoom in. Get Denzel right in the middle, and with the sharpening tool on our layer, just brush in, and it can be very effective very quickly. So switch it off and on, and you can see the brightness in the eyes. But there's a couple of gotchas. Let's do the antlers. You can see some noise around the antlers. So let's do the antlers though. Just brushing in here. and I'm going to deliberately go outside the lines, as it were, onto that noise, and over it again, and over the antler again. And every time I go over, not only is it sharpening, but it's getting very noisy. Okay, so this is fine if you're going to be a bit more control on your strokes and actually just not repeating yourself, not going over your own work. But once you start going over your own work, you start to get a lot more noise and things in there. But noise, we've always known, I say always known, from the beginning of this video I've said that noise is a trade-off against sharpening. Mind you, we are zoomed in somewhat. That would be the more likely viewpoint. But as you can see, we easily can go over the top with this. And yes, you can turn the strength down, or even you come to this layer and then take the opacity down on this layer. Or even if you're happy with what you've done, but you don't know how to undo a little piece, you could then put a white mask on, B for your brush tool, D for default colours, X to get black as your foreground, and then you can actually mask out the bits that you have done, like that. So that's a tool. I like it because you can get a brush and you can target and go on things in, and you can be very specific. I would use that just to bring out highlights in very specific parts. Highlights bring out sharpening in very specific parts. Alright, so the next one we'll have a look at, get rid of that, is a one I don't think I mentioned at the beginning, and that is high pass filter. So let's make a copy again, Control or Command J, and this time we'll go to Filter, and we'll go to Other, and we'll go to High Pass. Now we've said that sharpening finds edges and it increases the contrast around those boundaries, around those edges. This is what we're looking at here. So if I slide this over, there's a lot of edges. So this would be equivalent of the sharpening we saw in Lightroom at the beginning, when I threw it right over the far side before I applied a mask to tone it down. Think of this as that mask, because it's going from everything all the way down, pixel radius by radius, to hardly anything. Now I can still see the outline of the face. I don't know if it'll come through, but we're at 1.3 pixels. I'm going to say OK. And then I'm going to change the blend mode, because that's what you need to do here, to linear light. So where's linear light? There it is. And if I switch this off and on, you should be able to see, particularly, let's zoom in a bit. You can see that across all of the fur, all of the face. But the disadvantage here is it is the entire picture. But our mask is our friend. So we can either create a mask, and with a black brush, B for brush tool, take some of the sharpening out, like that. Or indeed we could have Control Z, put a black mask on to hide the whole lot, and change our brush, B for brush, D for default colours, white is now my foreground, and I can selectively brush in. So that's the high pass filter, but be careful that you don't overdo it. It's very easy to do. So if I get rid of that, was 1.6 pixels. If I get rid of that, Control Command J, quickly pop it on again. Other, high pass. You can barely see it, but I can from my end. But if I take it up so it's more obvious, there you should be able to see the face antlers there, and even that looks very, very faint. It looks like it wouldn't do much, but when I pop this into linear light, that is really over sharpened. Okay, but again, we could bring down the opacity. So just be careful when you're actually first setting up your high pass filter. Take it in little steps, make it so it's just barely perceptible at first, unless you're going to be deliberately knowing that you're going to brush things out. So there's the first two. We're going to move on now, and we're going to go and look at the actual sharpening filters, which are Sharpen, Sharpen Edges, Sharpen More, Smart Sharpen, and Unsharp Mask. Now, to be fair, I don't really use these two, hardly at all, but we'll have a look at them on this picture before we move on to the other pictures, and then we'll spend a little bit more time on Smart Sharpen and Unsharp Mask, which are the ones I prefer using. Right, so let's delete this, Control or Command J to make a copy of it again, and we're going to go Filter, Sharpen, Sharpen. Now notice there isn't three dots after it, which means this is it. It will just apply. There isn't a dialog box pop up to allow us to change any settings. I'm going to zoom in for this one. So I've applied that, and I didn't. Oh yes, you can. There is a slight sharpening there. It is very gentle. Let's do it one more time. So because I've previously run this filter, it will be there at the top for me. I don't have to reselect it, so I just go there. There, definitely see that more easily. So Control Z to get rid of that. Now, just to prove the sources for courses, I'm going to jump now over to this next picture. I'm going to zoom in, Control or Command J, and I'm going to run the same filter and switch this one off and on. Now, I don't know about you, but I can't see the difference. Whereas on this one, you can see the difference. Let's just try the third one. Control or Command J, zoom in. And let's go Filter, Applied. Yes, there's definitely the windows pop there. You can see the glow, particularly around the light bulbs in the windows. So the reason for showing you that, and we'll get rid of that one, is because sharpening does vary according to the type of picture, where boundaries can or cannot be easily perceived. No doubt sharpening would work well around here and on the green bits, but not where you've got the leaf overlapping the leaf. Okay, right, so Filter, Sharpen, Sharpen Edges. Oops, Control Z, get rid of that. Mark, what you're doing. Control J to make a copy. Now, Filter, Sharpen, Sharpen Edges. And let's switch off and on. And yes, it's more subtle again, but I can actually, once you know where to look, so I'm looking at just in here, the top part of the eye there, you can actually see the brightness come back in, and on the other eye as well. Let's zoom out, switch it off and on. No, so this one is quite subtle. So that was Sharpen Edges. Let's get rid of that. Control J to put a new one back in, and we'll finish off on this one. Sharpen more. What do you reckon this does then? Well, it's sharpened, and yes, I would think it was more than the previous one. Let's just do this. Control J, put this one in. Filter, Sharpen, Sharpen Edges. So if we go zoom in and we're doing edges, again I'm seeing that in the eye, definitely in some of the fur. More, oh, clearly is more when you compare it like that. So if I just switch that off, we're getting progressively sharper. Sharpen, Sharpen more. Hey, what do you know? The name actually suits what it does, but possibly a little bit strong for the whole picture. You might want to dial that back using the usual methods we've talked about, which is a noise reduction or a filtering to paint it in, or a black mask to then paint it in, or a white mask to then paint it out. All right, let's leave Denzel to a less sharp existence, and we'll go over now and we'll bring in these flowers, and we're going to be looking at Filter, Sharpen, Smart Sharpen. Alright, your dialog box might not look like that, it might look like this, so just click on that to bring these down. Now this is Smart Sharpen because it brings in shadows and brings in highlights. And there's a few extra sliders we need to talk about. Radius, I'm not going to mention because we've already talked about radius, it's the same in all of them. but we've got these new ones: fade amount, tonal width, and it's good to see noise reduction is in there. Noise reduction's in there right next to the 2, as it should be, because that helps us keep the balance. The slider's close at hand, actually keep the balance when we're doing things. Now there's this thing called remove, which has got Gaussian, lens and motion. So we need to understand what they do. So let's start there. I'll talk to you about these. We'll do a little bit of sharpening, and then we'll talk about shadows. Incidentally, before I just do that, one of the things I like about this dialog box, it's one of the few dialog boxes you can actually resize. Anyway, so what are these? What are these 3 options? Well, motion blur is for using sharpening when you have an image that has some sort of camera movement and you want to help minimize that. Perhaps there's a tutorial in the waiting to do with motion blur, along with some of the other filters, some of the blur filters, which include path, Gaussian, motion blur, etc. The Gaussian blur, it's the same sort of sharpening we will see in the Unsharp Mask. I won't say too much more about that at the moment, because when I explain what Unsharp Mask is and why it got its name, you'll understand why Gaussian blur or Gaussian blur is one of the options. But the best option and the default one, I thought it was the default one, but mine opened up not on lens blur. Lens blur is supposed to be the best all-round option for this. It emphasizes details. It helps to cut down on haloing, which is the white edging you can get if you sharpen things too much, and it doesn't sharpen noise as much. Okay, so these are the options to use when we're using our noise reduction. Okay, so lens blur is probably best for landscape type pictures as well, but the others have their uses. Gaussian is going to make this look a little bit more like when we use Unsharp, but lens blur is probably the best middle ground to start with. So we can put the amount on, we can set the radius, and we can do something to suit with our noise reduction. So what is so smart about this is it allows us to now target the sharpening within either shadows or highlights. So if I have my tonal width at 0 on these, then we are saying, and how much I want to fade the sharpening that we've just arranged up here. Well, I'm leaving it at 50-ish. If I've got my tonal width at 0 on the shadows, I'm saying stay really close to the shadows. Don't venture off. We're talking about dark shadows here. And as I move over, I'm saying I'm allowing the sharpening to head towards mid-tones. I find usually I play between 50 and 75, but it's picture to picture dependent. Similarly, in the highlights, we're saying stick to the highlights, stay, don't go lower, stay the high until we move over, and we're saying, all right, you can wander towards the mid-tones. So these 2 sliders allow you to say from the extremes of a shadow and a highlight how close in you want to bring and allow the sharpening to occur. And between the 2, you're not stuck with a singular amount, you've got the fade amount, which you can play with. And you can also change the radius independently on them. So let's, I'm going to keep these a bit further back. I'm going to bump the radius up to 2 pixels in the highlights and the shadows. And I'm going to bump the amount, put the noise about 50 and click up. Oh, I'm not going to click anything. I'm going to go Control Command J, and then we're going to go back in, filter, sharpen, smart sharpen. All right, these up, pixel, 2 pixels, there and there. I'm going to leave these around the 50 mark and confine them back to the edges quite a bit. Leave that radius there, put that a little bit more, click OK. And now if I switch off and on, you can see that coming through. It is subtle, it's coming through in the rain. But one thing to be sure, we can actually just rerun that again. So if you look, I'm trying to find a specific part which is more easier through a YouTube video to see, hence clicking on and off. But if you look at the sleeves down here, this shows it up a little bit more. You can see how it's brought that in. In fact, I'm going to delete that. I'm going to redo it, Control J, and put that first version on by itself, which is there, to see if the single shot worked. And yeah, you can see that coming in here. It is very subtle. There's a lot of control in there, but you can see how it's bringing that up and producing a nice, starting to crisp off some of the edges of this. And sometimes that's all it needs. And you've got your water drops as well, which are benefiting from this. I'll zoom out. Yes, I think I like the difference that's doing. I'm not usually this subtle, as you know from some of my other tutorials, but there you go. I rather like this particular one. It gives us a far greater granular level of detail. But what I like more than a pot full of flowers is my local pub. This is the glorious Gosforth Hotel in Gosforth on the High Street in North Newcastle, if you're ever around that way. It's worth popping in for a decent pint of beer. Right, what we're going to do with this, well, we're going to do Control Command J to start with, to take a copy. And our final filter on Sharpen is Unsharp Mask. And you can see straight away there's less sliders and things to worry about. So what is Unsharp Mask? Does it unsharpen things? No. Well, why is it called it? It's called it because there used to be a technique in the analog days of trying to sharpen and identify where the edges are by introducing a blur. The blur helped you find the edges. So let's think about that for the moment. On this layer here, I'm going to go Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur. And as you can see, it does exactly what you'd expect it to do. Now, if I blur this and then I was to overlay with the original, let's take that on above, bring the opacity down. Between the two, it helps me identify where the edge is, because on the sharpened one, not sharpened, I didn't mean to use the word sharpened, on the unblurred one, the edge may become more apparent when it's compared and contrasted to a blur. Does that make sense? Well, do you know what? It doesn't really matter if it makes sense. That was how it was explained to me, and in a bizarre way, I think it works. If you're not sure where the particular edge was and you blur it out a little bit, then put the edge on top, you'll see that definition, that boundary a little bit better. So that's why it's called Unsharp Mask, because it did use something that was soft, something that was a bit blurry, something that was not sharp, something that was unsharp. Anyway, does it really matter what it's called? Yes, because it really gets on my nerves. It's a really stupidly named filter. Come on, Adobe, let's call it something else. Sharpen, Unsharp Mask. We've got 3 sliders. The amount is fairly obvious. The radius is fairly obvious. We've come across radius on all of them. But what is threshold? Threshold is the secret to this particular tool. And so it's important that we understand it and get it right. Now, what does threshold range from? It ranges from 0. Oh, and when I put it to 0, look at that. The entire picture seems to have had some sharpening applied garishly. And if I put it to 255, it doesn't look any different from when I first made a copy of the layer. 255, we've seen this figure lots of times. So if I go into our color picker, and you see all the red, green and blue, and we move this around. When you go to the extremes, they're at 255. So red has got 255 levels of redness. Green, if we get a green there, has got 255 levels of greenness. So within those colours, it is divided between 0 and 255. So what you are doing when you run this particular filter, this Unsharp Mask, you are setting the threshold with which you want sharpening to be done. So it's easier by example. So let's say we set it for 10. All right, so we've now set the threshold for 10. Photoshop tries to find edges, and it does it by comparing pixel to pixel as it goes along. And if there's a stronger change in them between, let's say, for example, the last remaining pixel on that gutter and the first pixel on the sky, obviously a big difference, then Photoshop thinks, I found an edge. So what we're saying here is by setting it at 10, we are saying that if the two pixels you're comparing are similar in colour, that there's less than 10 levels between them, then do not sharpen them. Think about that. So now we're saying 255, if the two pixels you are comparing side by side here are less than 255 levels, don't sharpen. Therefore, it will not sharpen a single thing. If we say 0, if the two pixels side by side are less than 0, well, let's make it not less than 0, less than 1, then don't sharpen. But if they're more than 1 in levels difference, sharpen. So in other words, we're saying the vast majority of this picture is going to be sharpened. Now hopefully that makes sense, because it's with the threshold. Obviously radius and such always play a part, but with the threshold you now get to dictate exactly how much or how little you're allowing Photoshop to be specific about your sharpening. Now with Unsharp Mask, I tend to use it more for a pop, so I put that on, which if I click OK and we switch off and on, you can clearly see the pop in this picture. It's rescuing this picture because it was a little bit soft, and indeed I chose these particular pictures because they could all benefit from some level of sharpening. But here I would tend to sharpen it, hold down the Option or Alt key when I click on my mask to hide it, B for brush tool, D for default colours, white's my foreground colour, keep it quite soft, bring the flow down a little bit, and then I would do something to pop certain areas. So I'll click once there, I'm going to move along, hold down my shift and click once there, and I've put a line you can see across here. Hang on, I'll make these a little bit bigger so we can see the, oops, there it is, large thumbnails. You can see the line we've just made. And then I'll bring in the windows as well. So yes, it's a sharpening tool, but I'm doing it to help pop things. Now I wouldn't do it on grills because it can get a little bit messy. That said, I've just left that one there, and let's bring this down. Let's get the road sign to sharpen up as well, and the fire hydrant 4 yards to the southeast, the bar, and yeah, I'll leave it low. Let's bring the inside of the door and the reflection on the inside the door paint there. And the lamp, let's see if the lamp makes any difference. Alright, so, oh, that window there as well. So now, if I switch off and on, it's not over sharpened at all, even though that was a heavy sharpen, but it's popped the picture. And you can see, I don't like this effect here. I said avoid stripy things, avoid grills and things like that, because I don't think it works. So I'll go back on here, X to change my colour brush to black, and I'll just hide it off there. Switch off and on. So there you go. They're all your options for sharpening, and combine them with clarity, combine them with vibrance, using masks to either bring the sharpening in, bring the sharpening out. Don't necessarily go for the whole thing. Don't necessarily do one sharpening tool. You might find that you like one tool which gives you generic sharpening and you like it, but then you know what, you want to use your Unsharp Mask and go there and get some bits that really pop. But have a play. Let me know how you get on. Leave something in the comments. And while you're there, if there's other things you'd like to see me cover off in Photoshop and or Lightroom, just let me know. And who knows, I have got a to-do list of videos, but there's nothing to stop me squeezing the odd one on sometimes and progressing them to the top. And with that, I'm going to say bye-bye. Stay sharp.